Okay, we're going to get a little bit on the sciencey side and talk about the properties of sound, both in terms of how we experience them and how we describe them. So, what are we actually talking about? Well, we're talking about things like pitch, loudness, timbre, articulation, and rhythm. But that leads to some questions like how are they represented graphically? What's that waveform thingy that I keep talking about in class? Well, the waveform is a graphical representation of the changes in air pressure at the location it was recorded over time. It shows the number of cycles per second and the amplitude of each cycle, giving us both the frequency and the amplitude or volume of the wave. So here you can see a sine wave. On the y-axis, we have 0 at the center line, going up to positive max amplitude and going down to negative max amplitude. Typically, these will be normalized in your DAW as positive and negative 1. One positive half cycle is the entire positive component of the waveform. So from 0 up to the max and back down to 0. Similarly, you have the negative cycle, which is 0 down to negative max and then back up to 0. Together, you have a positive plus a negative cycle that equals one full cycle or period of the waveform. And then that waveform, if it's periodic, is going to repeat in the exact same method over and over and over until the sound stops. Pitch is how we talk about the sound's frequency. It's a perceptual measure, which means that the perception is happening in the brain. This is a really important distinction because the brain is not as smart as it likes to think it is. It can be fooled. And there's a very fine distinction between the close values that it can perceive and what it actually is hearing, because we don't hear frequencies the way you would think we do. There is not just a nice bump up from 440 hertz at A to 441 hertz at B flat. It's quite a bit more, actually, because we hear frequencies as exponential curves. So, for example, you have A440, the next A is 880. The A below 440 is 220 hertz. So you're doubling at every octave. Very, very important thing to keep in mind. Frequency is measuring the rate of how many times a wave completely cycles through the positive and the negative back to its starting point. This is also called cycles per second, or CPS, which you will see in some books, and actually in a lot of the Super Collider MIDI to frequency devices and methods. It's MIDI. It's .MIDI CPS. But you'll also commonly see them expressed in hertz, Hz or kilohertz, which is thousands hertz, which is kHz. The period is the measurement from one point of the compression or rarefaction cycle to the next occurrence. This gives you one complete wavelength. Typically, you will measure either from the max amplitude point to the next max amplitude point, the next max negative amplitude to the next max negative amplitude, or from the 0 point to the next 0 point after a full cycle. That will give you the complete wavelength. Smaller periods have more cycles per second, which corresponds to hearing those as a higher frequency. Larger periods, however, have fewer cycles per second, which means we hear them at a lower frequency. So here's an example of a 4 hertz frequency wave. All the way from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, you have 4 complete wavelengths. The amplitude is the same on both the positive and the negative, and everything is just perfectly periodic and repeating. With pitch and human hearing, the approximate range that you can hear is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. There's some variance on that side. Some people have been observed to go as high as 22,000 hertz. But it really does decrease as you age. I can't hear anything really above about 15 or 16 kilohertz distinctly. And that's just a function of age and playing in bands and not using earplugs as many times as I probably should have. But also, it is a really interesting phenomenon that is well observed. For example, in high-end stores, you frequently hear about the use of mosquito tone devices that are blasting out 17 kilohertz signals that keeps kids away from the doors and from loitering in front of the stores. Infrasonic frequencies are the frequencies that are below the range of human hearing. So anything 0 to 20-ish hertz. These are typically going to be used as modulation sources. They're very cool. They're what's called a low frequency oscillator, and we will definitely look at those a lot when we're talking about synthesis. It's also important to note that pipe organs, some of them can generate tones in that range, but most subwoofers cannot. Most subwoofers only go down to about 50 hertz. And it's not something that you can really hear even if you're standing right next to the organ. You can feel it though, and it will rattle your chest. It adds a lot of extra presence, and adding that specific set of frequencies does affect how you hear other things. Ultrasonic frequencies are anything above 20 kilohertz. These are literally dog whistles. They will drive your pets insane. The Beatles were very infamous for putting very, very super high frequencies at the end of Sgt. Pepper, and it annoyed your pets, and that was about it. But they are important because they add presence and some people would say sparkle to sound, and they can be very useful when you're doing things like spectral editing, which we'll talk about in Music Tech 2. Another thing to keep in mind is that pitch can be illusory. So, for example, there's the Shepard tones, which are an auditory illusion caused by loops of frequencies in octaves moving in a gradual ascending or descending manner with fades that stagger the overlap. There are two really, really good examples of that. The classic is James Tenney's piece, For Anne, Rising. But also in the soundtrack for Dunkirk, Hans Zimmer uses those to really kind of up the tension and just generate dramatic intensity. Also, for those of you who have played it, Super Mario 64, The Infinite Staircase, that is a great example of the Shepard tone. Loudness is the next one to talk about, the volume, or, in terms of perceptual property, the amplitude. This is how much the air pressure in a wave, compression or rarefaction, deviates from the normal ambient air pressure. And yes, I'm using air pressure, but it could equally be applied to water or a liquid state or a solid state of matter. We'll just keep going with air pressure though. In the waveform view, this is shown in how high the wave ascends for compression and how it descends for rarefaction from that center line. And again, typically the max compression value is normalized to +1 in the DAW, while the max rarefaction is not normalized to -1. Center is 0, and that represents the normal ambient air pressure. Now, it's currently and commonly represented in decibels, or dB, or in decibels of sound pressure level, which is dB SPL. So again, going back to our 4 hertz frequency wave, you've got the amplitude going up and going down. And that is on the y-axis, and that tells us that it's roughly the same in both directions. So with loudness, this is where things get interesting. With the range of decibels, you have 0 dB. This is the threshold of hearing. This is a whisper quiet from 100 yards away under laboratory conditions in an anechoic chamber. 45 to 55 dB is conversation at arm's length. 75 to 85 dB is chamber music. It's also a good recommendation for where to do your mixing at, just a hint. 92 to 95 dB is a loud grand piano. 120 is the threshold of pain. This actually starts to hurt. The threshold of pain is the loudest sound that humans can bear. Anything that is at or exceeding that level is physically painful and will cause permanent hearing damage with prolonged exposure. I can definitely attest to the pain factor. I have been in situations where you've been in, say, a large stone room and been blasted in the ear with the sound of a very high-pitched E-flat clarinet. It was not pretty. 140 plus dB is a jet engine taking off. And then 150 dB is peak volume at a really, really, really loud rock concert or hip-hop concert or whatever your genre of choice is. So wear hearing protection. That is the big takeaway here, especially if you are going to concerts or going into scenarios where you might hit the threshold of pain or above. In fact, there are several types of hearing damage we should talk about, like threshold shift, which, if you are exposed to excessively loud sounds, you will notice that all other sounds start sounding dull or muted as a result. This can usually be temporary, but it can be permanent with extensive hearing damage or extensive exposure to loud sounds. I have heard a lot of people who have this, and they would do anything to not have it. Then the other one is tinnitus. It is a persistent ringing in the ear due to exposure to excessively loud sounds. And I definitely have this in my left ear. It's about 6,000 hertz. I have localized it that much. So that was from getting blasted in the ear one too many times with loud sounds. It is permanent, usually. It can be temporary. It can go away. It's just a ringing in the ears. But for most people, it is permanent. There are no cures for these. Wear earplugs. Invest in some really good ones. Get them custom fitted. It is worth saving your ears. If you want more information on this, check page 24 of the book because it has a really nice chart of recommended exposure times. And in fact, for OSHA guidelines, you should not be mixing for more than 50 minutes at a time before taking a 10-minute break, ideally in silence, to let your ears reset. Let's talk about decibels for a little bit. Just like frequency, these are not linear measurements. They're not, strictly speaking, exponential either. Anytime you increase by 6 dB, the amplitude is actually doubling, but we don't hear it that way. Humans perceive a 10 decibel change as a doubling in the volume. So if you look at the faders on a DAW, it might go down to -70 and then bring it all the way up to 0, which is indicating that you're hearing the signal exactly at the level that it was input in. Every one of those, -70 to -60 is a doubling, -60 to -50 is doubling, and so on and so forth until you get to the original signal. So some perceptual differences. As I mentioned before, due to the way the human ear has evolved, we hear frequencies between 1 and 5 kilohertz better than other frequencies, and we really hear the 2 to 5 kilohertz range the best. We don't need as loud of a signal to hear them. And this is a really interesting thing. This is why bass frequencies require more amplification to bring them into a level with other instruments when you're mixing. Or if you're the bassist and you're playing live with a band, it's probably why your amp is significantly more powerful than everyone else's. Timbre. This is the perceptual property of the physical shape of the waveform, and that's a gross simplification. It is actually way more complex than that because waveforms are very, very rarely uniform. If you are using a sine generator, you'll have a nice sine wave and it will be perfect and uniform. But if you record, say, a violin playing a single note on an open string, you will notice variations very quickly. Part of that is, as mentioned before, instrument resonance, quality of the ear or the microphone, the medium in which the sound is being transmitted, and any other number of factors will influence how we hear this. Again, with the waveform, it is the shape of the wave oscillating back and forth over time, but once again, this is a bit of an oversimplification. However, there are classic waveforms that we can talk about that will be perfect textbook examples where everything is repeating exactly and there's nothing weird. These are the sine wave. The sine wave is the atomic unit of all sound. It cannot be reduced further beyond a sine, but multiple sine waves at different volumes can be summed to form any other waveform. Next is the triangle wave, which is a sharper, sloped version of the sine. The sawtooth wave, which is similar to the triangle, but it has a significant instantaneous cut when it reaches its peak. So it'll either ramp up or ramp down, and then immediately jump to the next value. Then you have the square or the pulse wave, which is an extension of the sawtooth in that it's jumping between a max and a minimum value. But with the square wave, where the wave is at max amplitude and then it switches to the minimum amplitude immediately, you're going to hear either full on or full off. And the result of that is really interesting because you have what's called the duty cycle. And the duty cycle allows you to set which proportion is on and which proportion is off. So if you have 50%, that gives you the square wave. If you have 25% off and 75% off, that will give you a slight pulse at the beginning and then a longer off part, which will change the timbre that you hear. If you have 75% on and then 25% off, that will give you a much longer part that's at the maximum and then only a very, very short part at the minimum, and that will, again, sound totally different in how you hear it. But let's take a look at these waveforms real quick. Here's the sine. It's just the classic smooth curve. You've seen this before pretty much everywhere. Next is the triangle. It looks like a triangle on either side of the zero axis, hence the name. Followed by the sawtooth. This is an ascending saw, and I should point out that the sawtooth in particular is interesting because it is not necessarily going to go both on the positive and the negative side of the line. You have some that are called bipolar, where they go both positive and negative, and then you have some that are called unipolar, where they will only be in the positive domain. So be aware of that, especially when we get into synthesis. That will become very important with saw waves and triangle waves. Finally, we have the square wave, or technically the pulse width modulation wave, or PWM, and this is showing the duty cycle. So at 50%, we have what I talked about, where it's on for 50% of the time and off for 50% of the time. At 75%, it's on more than it's off, and at 25%, it's off more than it's on. All of these will sound completely different. So getting back to that, we have another waveform to talk about beyond those, and that is noise. Noise is going to be a very, very important thing because a lot of waveforms have no set pattern. They're essentially random fluctuations in amplitude. But noise, at least in signal processing, in DAWs and in synthesizers, attempts to create certain tendencies of that random distribution. You have the classic white noise, which is equal energy across every frequency. This is the classic harsh static sound that we all know and love. Then you have pink noise, which is equal energy distributed across octave bands. It's less grating than white noise, and it sounds like it has more bass frequencies, even though they are still a noise signal. There are many, many more, but we will save those for synthesis. In the meantime, just be aware that they do exist. Another thing to be aware of is the phase. The phase is the position at which the waveform starts. So they can start at the 0 point, at max amplitude, at minimum amplitude, or somewhere in between. These are given in degrees, with 0 being the normal starting point. 180 degrees is starting halfway through the period, and 360 degrees is starting after one complete period. You will typically see phase knobs on effects like a flanger. You might see it on some reverb modules, and you will definitely see it on synthesizers as well. It's also really important when combining waves together, because waveforms, when you hear them together, are summed. So what happens is when they're in phase and you have an ascending phase on one and an ascending phase on the other, the volume increases. But where they're out of phase, it will result in a decrease. If you have one that's ascending and another that's descending, you might get a little volume cut out halfway through. And if the signal is 100% identical, but perfectly out of phase, 180 degrees, you will result in phase cancellation and theoretically silence. And this actually can happen. I can show you how to do this with a figure 8 mic and a little bit of phase inversion later. So here's an example of two waveforms that are perfectly in phase. You can see the blue and the red together, and they sum to the green sine wave that has a larger, more pronounced amplitude on both the positive and the negative axis. Then below that, you have the 180 degrees out of phase version, where when summed together, flat line, silence. Again, this is kind of a laboratory condition. It's very rare that you'll have total silence when you're mixing, but you will notice a very, very steep roll-off of bass frequencies. Next up is articulation. Articulation is a perceptual description of how the sound changes over time. This is based on the idea of the amplitude envelope, which we will discuss in excruciating detail in synthesis. But the idea basically is that when you start a sound, it is starting at 0 dB, ramping up to its maximum value, whatever that may be, decaying to a sustained level, and then finally, when you release the note, it dies back down to silence at 0 dB when you stop the note. There are two major types of envelope. The classic is the ADSR, or attack, decay, sustain, release. So the attack time, or the A, is how long it takes from when you hit a note on your keyboard for it to ramp up to the maximum volume. Decay is the next part. That is how long it takes to go from the max amplitude to the sustain level, followed by the release, which is how long it's going to take from the end of the sustain when you release the key to go back to 0. Sustain is a little bit different. Sustain as a parameter is not time-based. Sustain is instead a percentage value given in relation to the max amplitude. So you'll typically set, say, ramp up for X milliseconds, decay for X milliseconds, sustain at 75% of the max, and then release in X milliseconds. The ADSR is a really good analog for any type of bowed or blown instrument that can sustain. So strings, winds, brass. It is a classic choice in synthesis for shaping notes and for creating modulations. The other type of envelope that we should look at is the attack and release. It can also be called an attack and decay envelope in some books and on some modules. This is a much, much simpler envelope. So as soon as a note starts, it ramps up to its max volume, then immediately goes back down with no sustain. It's a really good representation of any type of struck or plucked instrument like percussion or guitar. It's also really common for creating the classic buchla bongo sound in West Coast style synthesis. And this is another one that's really fun. You can simulate that if you only have an ADSR envelope generator. All you do is you set sustain and decay to 0 or sustain and release to 0, depending on the manufacturer of the envelope generator. And I should also point out that with all envelope generators, For the most part, you can shape the curve as well. It's not necessarily just a linear process for the attack, decay, and release. It can be exponential or logarithmic, which will change how you hear things. An exponential curve is closer to how the ear perceives sound naturally, so that can be a very useful thing when you're working in synthesis. Here's a graphic showing the ADSR envelope. Again, everything happens when you hit a key. You go into that attack phase, you ramp up to your max amplitude, immediately decay, then it holds at the sustain percentage of the max envelope before releasing. And as soon as you take your finger off the key, it enters the release phase and ramps back down to 0. Typically, these are measured in milliseconds, maybe up to 2 seconds, although on some devices you can get very, very ridiculously long durations for the attack and release in particular. The attack and decay envelope, or the attack and release envelope, is much, much simpler. You hit a key and it just goes up and back down. You can release the key halfway through and it still is not going to change it. This is a one-shot. You press a key and it goes up and goes back down, and it doesn't matter when you release it. Rhythm is the next one to talk about. This is the perceptual meta-analysis of the timing of events. That's really kind of wild, so let's take a look at what it means. In order to get into there, let's talk about transients. Transients are the short spikes in sound. This is typically the attack and decay portion of the envelope that are easily identified in the waveform view and that are easily heard. These are going to be a really, really sharp spike that you see, and they're very, very, very prominent. Usually they're going to be the loudest things, especially on percussion tracks. And then you'll have a much finer and longer sustain and decay. The analysis of transient patterns is called beat detection, and it is a common feature in DAW. And this is very cool because you identify the beats, just go through and hit the identification hotkeys. And once you've identified those, you can extract information for timing offsets or grooves, or you can snap transients to specific bars and beats by quantizing them using elastic audio, flex time, warp mode, stretch mode, whatever they call it in your DAW of choice. And this is a very, very useful thing in both recording and mixing, because you might have a drummer who's perfect in every single way except for that one snare hit that is just slightly off and it's driving you crazy. This is how you fix that. So here is a really good photo that shows the transients. You'll notice that there's stuff happening before the transient, that it's kind of a noisy signal, and then immediately it spikes up and it jumps up, and then you have a long decay into sustain, much the same type of noise as before, another immediate spike up and then back down, another immediate spike up and back down. If I had to guess, since I didn't record this myself, I would say the first one is probably a cymbal followed by a snare and a snare. But those are transients. And hearing the pattern of the transients, hearing those attacks, and they're very prominent here on a percussion track, but you will see them in every single track. Those will tell you where the notes are occurring. That's how we hear events. That's how we perceive the timing of events. And our brain keeps track of where the previous ones were. It starts to form a tempo map inside the brain. Then it hears another transient, and it's either adjusting the tempo map to go and say, oh, okay, well, this is a eighth note, or this is a quarter note, or this is a whole note, or it's just kind of freaking out and going, hey, this is all over the place. This guy has no idea what he's doing. I can't find any information. Brain fry. But that is just a quick look at the transient and how the brain perceives rhythm. That regularity is the key to perceiving the tempo, and then the regularity of where the transients are occurring is how we perceive rhythm.